The psychiatric diagnostic system that started in the 1950s is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. That's a long name for a book, and it is very descriptive. It is a book of diagnoses that is based upon statistics and is created by psychiatrists. And all three of those things are actually very important. The Book of Diagnoses is a replacement for the diagnostic system that Freud generated. In fact, the broader story of why this diagnostic system actually started in the early 50s actually goes back to Freud himself. While Freud was working and theorizing, the field of psychiatry kind of encircled Freud's work. In fact, it was a process that you generally don't see in scientific organizations now, and that is when Freud said something, everybody basically had to go along with it. If you disagreed with Freud, there would oftentimes be a large split, and people would wind up separating themselves from the psychoanalytic community. In fact, you literally could lose your job by arguing against Freud if you were a psychiatrist back in the early 20th century. As a result, very few people actually would publicly argue about the Freudian system, and essentially Freud had a stranglehold on the theoretical developments that occurred up until the point at which he died in 1939. After he was gone, the field was able to open up the amount of arguing and discussion about Freud's methods, so much so that during the 40s, it was decided that a new diagnostic system had to be developed. And after many years of development, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association was the final result, the DSM, which we still have today. The DSM is now in its 5th edition, last published in 2013. It actually came out in 1952, and it is essentially the big book of mental illnesses, right? All of the ways in which it is recognized that people can become psychologically disordered is in this book. That's essentially what it is. And for the first time, only recently, it has now been integrated into the ICD-10. The ICD-10 is the International Classification of Diseases, which is essentially the big book of illnesses for the field of medicine. And that's in its 10th edition. So the field of psychology and psychiatry are blending into the broader aspect of all of medicine. And that is only a fairly recent development. Back to the name in the DSM. Of course, it is a book of diagnoses, but it is based primarily upon statistics. When people contribute information to the next edition of the DSM, what they're doing is representing the types of symptoms that their patients have. And all of that information gets compiled statistically to evaluate what is the likelihood that a particular type of symptom would occur under a particular diagnostic heading. And one of the primary statistical processes that's used to combine this information together to see what is correlated with what, when there are so many different variables, is, of course, factor analysis. And again, remember, factor analysis was a mainstay in the development of intelligence testing. It became a main component of the development of personality testing, and it is also a backbone statistically of the development of psychiatric categories. Back in Freud's time, psychiatric categories were essentially designed based upon Freud's theorizing. So if you violated something related to Freud's theory, you were identified as having a psychological disorder, and that was the end of it. There was no discussion about it. Now, given the changes in the way the diagnostic system were made, the system requires that a statistical proof actually be present for the presence of particular types of symptoms or which various types of systems cluster together. That's called comorbidity. When, for example, you have a problem with hallucinations and alcoholism. That oftentimes occurs because if a person is hallucinating and they are not currently seeking treatment, they may begin to drink alcohol as a way to try to suppress the psychiatric symptoms they have, and then they may wind up as an alcoholic. So you oftentimes wind up seeing those two problems combined together. Now, the development of the DSM is actually very remarkable. And it's, again, I think this may be the third and possibly the final time that I bring this kind of stuff up about Freud, but Freud was not liked by everybody in terms of the field of science. And even in the field of psychiatry itself, a field that Sigmund Freud created. And notice, it's not the field of psychology, it's a field of psychiatry. The difference being that the field of psychology started with Wilhelm Wundt in 1879. It was basically the combination of philosophy and biology to be able to understand why people think the way they do. Psychiatry specifically was related to individuals that had gone to medical school and then began to study psychological problems. And so they referred to themselves as psychiatrists. Why not just call themselves psychologists? Well, frankly, I think the problem is simply related to the history of the medical field. The field of medicine in general has kind of placed itself up on a pedestal. Medical doctors treat themselves as though they're better than biologists and certainly better than other fields of science. You see it in the culture of medicine still today. And I think that's essentially the reason why. As a medical doctor, Freud did not want to associate himself so much with psychologists, so he created his own field, psychiatry. And it was only going to be for individuals who had gone to medical school and then studied psychological problems afterward. But of course, from Freud's standpoint, they were going to have to study those psychological problems from the standpoint of psychiatry, or I should say, from the standpoint of the Freudian psychoanalytic system. So why did the DSM develop in the early 50s? Well, it was largely because Freud had such a stranglehold on the theoretical developments in the field of psychiatry that nobody could really argue with him, that when he finally died and people were allowed to open up the venue for discussion for a wider range of things, it led to the conclusion that Freud's system was overly restrictive and that a better system had to be developed. So consider this. Now, I'm going to say this again in a slightly different way. Freud created the field of psychiatry, and after Freud died, the field of psychiatry rejected Freud. Remarkable, right? We saw the same problem with Allport and Maslow. We saw actually in the learning chapter with John Watson. And here, this is actually now not the third person, but the fourth instance in which there was a formal attempt to get away from Freud. And in this one, becoming the diagnostic system. Keep all of this in mind as you go out into the world and you are constantly faced with Freudian information presented to you in the media as though it was actually correct. Now, let's take a look at this question. Which of the following do you think has done the most to inform research on mental illness since the 1950s? And the correct answer is factor analysis. It is factor analysis as the mathematical backbone to the field of psychological diagnostic systems that has done the most to determine which components of symptomology cluster together that you could refer to them as a construct under a particular umbrella heading. So for example, as we're going to see on the next slide here as we go into anxiety disorders, why is there a category name of anxiety disorders? Is it because people have anxiety? Well, they do, but that's not why the category of anxiety disorders exists. The category of anxiety disorders exists because when you feed in all the various types of symptoms that people have, you will find that there is a cluster of a set of types of disorders that occur that you see on the screen here that all have anxiety disorders as a primary symptom. And so with anxiety as a primary symptom for all of these different categories, you simply create the category anxiety disorders. That set of clustering is largely done through factor analysis testing. So it's important to keep in mind that unlike Freud's system where he kind of made up, who should be and who is not psychologically disordered, today psychological diagnoses are created through a mathematical process, specifically a statistical process using factor analysis as a way to cluster various symptoms together to form construct categories. Remember, constructs, they are groupings of multiple systems that come under one umbrella term, and that's exactly what anxiety disorders are. There are a variety of different types of anxiety disorders, all of which play themselves out in slightly different ways, but they all have anxiety as a primary component. Generalized anxiety disorder is a disorder generally in which a person feels a low-grade anxiety all day long. When they wake up in the morning, all through the day, up until the time they go to bed at night, they feel somewhat anxious. They never understand why they feel anxious. They oftentimes try to associate it with life events. And because all of us have some amount of stress in our life at any one time, these individuals will oftentimes look at those various components of stress as actually being responsible for it. Frequently, people that know these individuals are the ones that start to recognize that this person must have an anxiety disorder, largely because they see that the person is anxious all the time. The patient may not necessarily recognize it as a generalized anxiety disorder, whereas the people around them will recognize that no matter what happens, good things or bad things, they always have anxiety. Panic disorder. A panic disorder is an extremely intense experience of anxiety that may last for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then it stops. In fact, it starts at a point with no warning. So you could be going about your day, and then suddenly you have this enormous amount of anxiety, so much so that you think you're going to die. And then it'll run its course over the course of 20, 30 minutes, and then it will simply stop. That's a panic disorder. Panic disorders are generally caused by stress in a person's life, but it plays itself out in a way that you're not always consciously aware of the stress you have, but the symptomology of it will kind of show up as this brief, intense component of anxiety all at one time. Now, if you took that brief component of anxiety and in a panic disorder, you can't associate it with anything, but now you can associate it with something, then it would be called a phobia. So like on the screen, you see there's a spider. Now, if a spider like that was in the room with you and you had a phobia for spiders, you would have an intense anxiety reaction. If you remove the spider, the anxiety goes away. You bring the spider back, the anxiety returns again. So there's a clear setting event, right? There's a specific stimulus in the environment that elicits the anxiety. And when you eliminate the stimulus, then you eliminate the anxiety. That's a phobia. If you have the same degree of anxiety, but you cannot identify anything that occurs or makes it go away, then it's referred to as a panic disorder. And if you take all of that anxiety that you see in phobias or panic disorders and simply spread it out over the course of the entire day so that it's always present, that's essentially a generalized anxiety disorder. So you can actually see that there's an underlying change from generalized anxiety disorder to panic disorder to phobia, in which you go from a low-grade disorder, which is always there, which is never has anything turn it on or turn it off, it's just always there, to taking all the anxiety and having it turn on and turn off with no recognized setting event, and then to a phobia where you have a clear setting event for why it turns on and why it turns off. So there is an underlying relationship between these various disorders. The obsessive compulsive disorder, we're actually going to talk about in more detail in a couple of slides. I'm going to hold off talking about it now. And post-traumatic stress disorder, we've actually talked about a number of times throughout the semester, so I'm not going to go over too much anymore. I'll just briefly remind you of what we have said starting back in Chapter 2. Post-traumatic stress disorder seems to have a underlying biological component which causes it to occur. And that underlying biological component is the fact that the amygdala, which is the area that controls fear and aggression, is physically close to the hippocampus, which is an area that establishes memories. And any two areas of the brain that are physically close to each other have an easier time of influencing each other than two areas that are further away. So you are, as a human being, biologically prepared to form negative memories of fear and aggression, more easily than memories of happiness. And happiness would be processed through your reward center. And your reward center, if you remember, is at the top of the limbic system. And when I talked about how the limbic system is shaped like a giant ram's horn, the very top of the horn is where you wind up seeing the reward center, where you would process things like happiness or joy. But all the way at the end, where the amygdala is where you're processing fear and aggression. And it happens to be that that's the area next to the hippocampus, which helps form memories. So you simply have an easier time of forming extremely strong memories of things related to fear and aggression. But you never see, and in fact, this is not even a psychiatric disorder, there's no such thing as a post-traumatic joy disorder. That, you won $60 million in the lottery, and now you can't stop thinking about it so much that you're incapacitated and have to go to a psychiatrist to talk about the fact that you can't stop thinking about how you have $60 million. That's simply not a thing. There is no such obsessively established joyful memory that occurs. That's not a psychiatric category at all. I've never heard about it. I don't believe it exists at all. And the reason it doesn't seem to exist is simply because the hippocampus and the reward center are too far apart from each other. If we follow up on the issue of phobia, which is actually a fairly well-studied topic, we'll actually see that in cross-cultural studies, there is a small number of things, actually 7 of them specifically, 7 underlying biological properties that establish phobias globally. So this is cross-cultural information. No matter which culture or country you go into, you will find people with a fear of snakes, up to somewhere in the order of about 2/3 of a population. About half of a population will be afraid of heights. Rats, upwards of 40%. Small spaces, about the same amount. Fear of insects as well. Dogs and cats. So again, keep this in mind. This is cross-cultural work that you see fairly consistent from place to place. And even the presence of these particular types of phobias occur even in scenarios where people don't live in areas where they would have much exposure to it. So if you go to a country that's mostly flat, like Saudi Arabia, so it's not, not mountains, people that live there would show a fear of heights to the same degree as people that live in a mountainous country. People that live in northern Canada where there are no snakes would have just as much fear of snakes as people that live in Ecuador where there's snakes everywhere. Same thing with rats and small spaces and so forth. And in fact, whenever you find a consistent pattern of human behavior cross-culturally, there's always one basic explanation that psychologists are going to fall back onto. If you see the same pattern of behavior everywhere, regardless of culture and even regardless of time period, then it's very likely a biologically based pattern of behavior. And if it's biologically based, then it is probably developed through the process of evolutionary psychology. That is, evolution through the process of the manner in which human beings and our ancestors have developed over time simply have led to the development of these particular fears existing in human biology. So they are assumed to be passed genetically, and that they are a component of our genetic history. So, for example, when you take a look at it, snakes. Most snakes are not venomous, but if you have no fear of snakes whatsoever, and you're willing to get near them because they just don't bother you, there's a very tiny proportion of people that will get bitten by a venomous snake and then die. And consider this is well before hospitals, right? We're going back literally hundreds of thousands of years. Those individuals that have no fear of snakes, even though they may be getting killed off at a very slow rate, simply fall out of the gene pool. And what you're left with are the human beings that had some natural fear of this legless lizard thing, right? A snake. And so most of the people that are alive today are simply descendants of individuals that had some fear of snakes. That same sort of argument holds true when you look at heights. For people with absolutely no fear of heights, they would be more likely to climb a tree, go to the edge of a cliff. Now, that's not happening every day for all people all around the globe, but it's going to happen at a very low rate, but over a vast period of time. And that's just the way evolution works. Tiny, tiny differences over a vast period of times can wind up making very large changes to the gene pool. And that's the assumption that has occurred in this case. You can't really prove this. You can establish a story that seems to make sense with respect to evolution, but of course nobody was there to actually see this take place, and the field of genetics has not advanced itself sufficiently so that you could put a time frame on when these phobic responses may have actually started to develop, and whether or not you could even pull out genes from the archaeological record to see whether or not, prior to that point there were differences in genes that made people not afraid of snakes or not afraid of heights. The issue also with rats. Rats frequently carry diseases that influence human populations, just like the Black Plague, even if it wasn't the rats themselves, but it might have been a disease on the fleas that were on the backs of the rats. And so a fear of rats would make sense with respect to human beings because humans are often affected by rats and, in general, the diseases that they can spread. Small spaces are places that you can get stuck in. If you ever watch any NOVA programmings or other types of scientific programs about archaeology, it's very clear that ancient peoples used to climb down into caves long distances, a mile underground. And there are plenty of small spaces. As archaeologists go down there now, sometimes they literally have to find the smallest people, the smallest archaeologists, to be able to fit through the tiny crevices to get into the other areas where bodies may have been buried or where there's archaeological things to dig up. And so it's the same thing. If you climb into a small space and you get stuck, that's a good way to die. If you're not afraid of small spaces, then those people may have wiped themselves out of the gene pool. Insects, again, very much like snakes, most are not venomous. But even insect bites, in some cases, even if they are only the venomous ones we're talking about, could cause infections. And infections hundreds of thousands of years ago could have been a thing that would result in death, unlike today. Dogs, not considering domesticated dogs, but the assumption in terms of phobias with respect to dogs is that the fear of dogs and human beings has come as a result of the ancestors of dogs, wolves, who used to hunt down and eat or kill human beings. So that there should be a natural fear of dogs in human beings because if you were out in the woods by yourself, a pack of wolves could actually kill you. So it would always be advantageous to you to be afraid of dogs, stay away from the areas where wolves might have been, and so forth. Same story with cats, but in terms of large cats, right? Not little buttons that you have at home that's so cute, but a lion, a tiger, a leopard, or other types of large cats that actually could cause serious damage to you. It's just that a domesticated cat today is just a smaller version of the same thing, just like with a domesticated dog, and some people still carry the gene, and that theoretically, right, some people are still carrying those genes for fears of dogs and cats, that it still spills over into the modern domesticated version of those animals. Now, one of the other things here that is on this list is airplanes. And airplanes doesn't seem to make sense with respect to the overall story of evolution because airplanes have only been around for about a century. So how does airplanes fit in? And that's a question I'm going to ask you right now. So if you want, stop the video, think about it for a moment, and I'll give you the answer in a second or two. Okay. The reason why airplanes appears to be on this list, so that if you go around the world now, cross-culturally, about 30% of the human population is afraid of flying on an airplane. It seems to come from two of the more basic biological fears. The first, fear of heights, and the other one, a fear of small spaces. So modern aircraft generally does not give much space, even standing up. The fuselage is round. There's not a lot of room in there, especially, of course, if you've sat in a modern aircraft. There's not a lot of leg room. You are kind of cramped in, and then on top of that, you go up high up into the air. You have two of the more basic biological fears that are combined together in a modern device. Now, one of the things that we could talk about that's related to this, actually, which again kind of brings Freud back into the story, which is somewhat amusing, but this is the way the whole story played itself out. Back in World War II, many Freudian psychiatrists were very interested in seeing whether or not human beings would become afraid of airplanes and bombs. And that's largely because cities were being bombed and devastated by airplanes. And bombs and airplanes are both tube-shaped. And from a Freudian psychoanalytic standpoint, tube shapes are always symbolic of penises. And that feeds back into the whole Freudian psychoanalytic story. So if these giant, dangerous penises were dropping bombs, which were themselves other penises, onto cities and exploding and causing... I'm sorry, I have to laugh when I say these things because it's so ridiculous. But the psychoanalysts actually thought that this would actually cause a high spike in fear of machinery like airplanes. And it actually did not. The unique part of this whole story was Even though an airplane and the pilot in the airplane is specifically trying to kill you, you don't become afraid of the human being. You don't develop a phobia of people, and you don't develop a phobia of an airplane. You don't develop a phobia of a bullet. You don't develop a phobia of a bomb. What you do have a phobia for is when you live in London and your city's being bombed, you run down into the subway system for safety. And what's down there when the bombs are exploding up on the street? Rats. The rats are scattering because of all the noise from the bombs that are blowing up in the street. And you have to deal with the rats. And that's the thing that causes you a great deal of disgust and agitates a phobia for rats. But after the bombing raid is done, you go up on the street, you're no more afraid of getting in an airplane than you ever were. You're not afraid of tube shapes. You're not afraid of bombs. You're not afraid of bullets. It's the rats specifically that you wind up with a problem with, but never the actual modern aircraft that is the thing that's really trying to kill you. And now another one of the anxiety disorders we talked about was obsessive compulsive disorder, and I said that we would get back to it. Well, obsessive compulsive disorder has a very odd name. Obsessive and compulsive seem to mean the same thing. And so with a disorder that you repeatedly do things, it almost sounds like a joke that you give it a double name, obsessive and compulsive. But you have to recognize the difference between obsessive and compulsive. Obsessive specifically refers to a repeated thought in your head, whereas a compulsion or compulsive refers to a repeated overt behavior. So, for example, you can have obsessive thoughts about killing yourself, but you cannot compulsively kill yourself, right? That would obviously be ridiculous. And in fact, obsessive thoughts about killing yourself is actually one of the more common types of obsessive thoughts. Oftentimes, other types of things related to bad luck or that something bad will happen, and you kind of have these thoughts that repeat in your head over and over and over again. Now, let's take a look at how the cycle of the cycle of thinking occurs in obsessive compulsive disorder. For a person with an OCD, generally they will have obsessive thoughts. Now, they may not be consciously aware of them because they may be fairly low grade. In some cases, they may be really upfront, and the person will be very aware of them and unable to stop them from occurring. But either way, you always start with some degree of obsessive thinking. It may be very minor, it might be very intense, which will simply change the degree of intensity of the problem, but the same process is going to occur. Now, the obsessive thoughts will lead a person to have anxiety. So if we stick with the most common OCD, a fear of germs. For example, a person will have a general fear of germs, and that general fear of germs and the thought that touching things might have something yucky on it, a bacteria or a virus, and you wipe your hands on your shirt, and then you feel like your shirt was dirty, and you got to wash your hands, and then change your shirt afterward, and then wash your hands after that because you just took your shirt off. That anxiety comes from these obsessive thoughts about germs being everywhere. The only way to alleviate the anxiety for the person with an OCD is to exhibit some pattern of behavior. Now, that pattern of behavior may be logically connected to the obsessive thinking, or it might not. It really doesn't matter. Oftentimes they are connected, but they are not always. In the case of an OCD regarding germ phobias, mostly the compulsive behavior will be logically related, and it will be hand washing or some sort of hygienic routine, where you have to change your clothes 3 times per day because you feel like your clothes have become contaminated. So the obsessive thoughts about germs make anxiety occur. Then the anxiety can only be alleviated by engaging in some compulsive behavior. That eventually leads to relief of anxiety. But the obsessive thinking never goes away, and it continues to build up anxiety again. So the person again has to exhibit the compulsive behavior to alleviate the anxiety, after which the obsessive thinking continues to build up the anxiety again, and around you go. And the process just never stops. And there are ways, of course, to stop it, and we will talk about some of those things later on, like response blocking as one, to stop the person from exhibiting the compulsive behavior and causing the anxiety to extinguish, as we talked about in the learning chapter. You have the anxiety, but if you don't allow yourself to engage in the compulsive behavior, eventually the anxiety will extinguish, and the OCD will weaken itself over time. Here are the three most common OCDs that occur, split in terms of obsession and the compulsive behavior. The most common being dirt or germs, and hygienic activities. You could see that hygienic activities is logically related to the presence of dirt. In the second most common, a generalized fear of something bad happening. And then they have repeating rituals, which are, of course, not logically related to the fear, because if you have a fear that something bad is going to happen unless you touch the table right now, there's no logical connection between touching a table and no more bad things happening, right? There's no physical connection in there. That's just a superstitious connection. So in some cases, the relationship between the obsession and the compulsion have no physical or logical connection between them. The third most common OCD is an obsession about keeping things very orderly, symmetrical, orderly, keeping things very exact. And in that case, oftentimes the compulsive behavior is related to checking things. And there's a variety of different ways in which this plays itself out. A person may be very concerned about staying safe, for example. So they're going to have a fear of something bad happening, let's say in the second OCD. And what they do is, before they go to bed, they check to make sure that all the doors and windows are locked. They make sure the oven is off. They go to bed, but then they continue to develop anxiety because, as we saw in this previous slide, once you have completed all the compulsive behaviors, it doesn't stop the obsessive thinking from occurring, and you start to become anxious again. So then you have to get back out of bed, go back and double check the doors and the windows and make sure the oven is off, return to bed, and then as you're laying in bed, you may start to feel anxious again, feel like maybe you possibly missed something and you want to double check it, and you go back out a third time and triple check at that point. When you start, double checking, triple checking, quadruple checking, something that's actually very simple to check, that's when you start getting the impression that you actually have a diagnosable OCD in that particular case. Because remember, the definition for a psychological disorder, you have to have statistical infrequency as one of the components. And all of us probably have some concern over safety, and we lock our doors and our windows and we make sure the oven is off before we go to bed. But almost none of us get out of bed after that. Some of us might, but if you only get out of bed one more time to double check, it's really not that big of a deal. Nobody's going to wind up having to claim that it's a psychological disorder that you need treatment for. But if you can't get to sleep for an hour because 15 times you have to get out of bed, that is extremely statistically infrequent, and therefore, by that one component, it starts looking like a psychological disorder. So let's take a look at how an OCD will play out in terms of a germ phobia.
Robert's condition went undiagnosed for 10 years. In the meantime, his obsessive-compulsive disorder put a tremendous strain on those who loved him.
This just messed everything up. I mean, it just was horrible. It was really horrible.
And again, probably the last 2 years and definitely the last 6 months, it escalated so greatly that I didn't want to be with my son.
The Barnetts live in suburban New Jersey. Robert believed his entire house was contaminated, and his parents and brothers were spreading the contamination everywhere they went.
From day one, things started getting contaminated. And then by people living in the house and not knowing the situation, they would, without even knowing it, they were contaminating every item for me.
I thought I could solve the problem by cleaning everything. Well, I'll just take something, I'll go, show me, I'll scrub it. But he said that's not it, it's not dirt.
Even the simplest things were 2-3 times as hard for me because of these rituals I had to go through.
Simply leaving the house set in motion a series of decontamination rituals that began in the shower.
I had clothes that I couldn't even keep them in my dresser in my room. They had to either stay in the dryer or folded on top. Usually the top layer I didn't want to use because I figured someone probably brushed into them. So it was kind of like my buffer to the clean clothes.
Any item that touched a contaminated area had to be re-washed, or Robert would suffer tremendous anxiety.
I had to be very careful not to bunk into his clothes, which were like this high, or reach over into the cabinets and grab something. And if something fell out of the closet, I couldn't let him know because it would be he'd be so upset.
I'd go into the bathroom and start to use the toiletries. I would use the deodorant, put it back, wash my hands. Brush my teeth, put it back, wash my hands. If I use gel, you pick up the bottle, you put it in, you rinse that hand off, so now you can put it in your hair because you don't want to contaminate your hair. Take out a brush, kind of rinse it off so that it's not contaminated from in the drawer. Brush your hair. When you put that away, you wash your hands anyway again. Finally get to the point where you can put your shirt on and grab your jacket and get ready to go out the door. I would open the door, make sure it didn't blow shut with the wind, wash my hands. Walk through and push the door closed with my foot.
You may recognize some of those foot use behaviors indoors when you use a public restroom. That's very common. People will wash their hands in a public washroom, and then while using the towel, after they dry their hands with a towel, they'll use the towel to grab onto the door handle to pull it open. Or maybe even sometimes just wait for somebody to come in so they can scoot out of the bathroom real fast. Possibly use their foot. Use their foot to flush a toilet or flush a urinal. Because there's a very common disgust with the thought of germs in general, bacteria and viruses. You hear about it in the media quite a bit. And as a result, many people are very cautious about the types of things that they touch and the manner in which they do. So it is very common to see people take the towel that they have dried their hands with, pull open the public restroom door, and then throw the towel in the direction of the trash can. Not being very concerned about whether they get it in or not, because they're much more concerned about not touching the door. So let's ask a general question here. How many of you feel that you have at least a slight obsessive thought or compulsive behavior? there's no right answer in this particular case. This issue is an opinion one, but it's a question I have asked for years in my general psychology classes, and you might be surprised to find out that very, very consistently, about 90% of the class says, yes, I do. It's extremely common. Yes, I do, 90% of the time. And this is, when you're asking a class of 300 students whether or not they have any slight obsessive thought or compulsive behavior, the answer is 90%. And this is very important for you to think about, because when you're thinking about OCD and anxiety, you may be listening to this lecture and thinking, oh my God, I got that one. I got this one. I got that one. But you know what? You don't. And the reason you don't is because everybody else does. You see, it's the issue of statistical infrequency again. If 90% of the population feels that they have a slight obsessive thought or compulsive behavior, and you also have one, then it's not a disorder anymore. It's just a pattern of behavior that exists. And as a result, it cannot be classified as a psychological disorder. It may be somewhat bothersome to you, and it will be something that you don't like occurring, but it won't necessarily be specifically a psychological disorder unless it becomes intense enough so that the intensity makes it statistically infrequent. Now, there's another movie here about obsessive compulsive disorder that's specifically related to Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a serial killer from the late 80s, early 90s. The reason why we bring up a serial killer in this particular case is because Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer as a result of an OCD. He had obsessive thoughts about creating a perfect slave. That's what he wanted. He wanted to turn somebody into kind of like a 1950s sci-fi version of like a zombie slave that would just go do whatever he had said. And so he would trick people back to his house. He would drug them, drill a hole into their head, and pour acid directly onto the brain in the hopes of turning them into a zombie that would just willingly do whatever he had said. And of course, if you drill a hole in a person's skull and pour acid on the brain, there's a good chance you're going to wind up killing the person, which is, of course, what happened. But because he still had obsessive thoughts about trying to control the individual, having accidentally murdered them, he instead tried to make the best of it by eating them, so that he kept their body parts in his refrigerator and he would make food out of them. So that way he could control them by having them become part of his own body. And so in this film, you'll see an interview with Jeffrey Dahmer, his father, who's sitting next to him, and they're being interviewed by a fellow named Stone Phillips.
Was this about some kind of desire to keep these people with you, not to be abandoned, not to have them leave?
I think that did play into it, but there was a big element of wanting complete control over someone, total control, not having to consider their wishes, being able to keep them there as long as I wanted. And that was a big part of it. Lust played a big part of it, controlling lust. Once it happened the first time, it just seemed like it had control of my life from there on end. It was a major part of my thinking from then on.
Did you want to try to stop?
Yes, I tried. I tried to stop.
And the killing did stop, for a while. But Jeffrey says in 1984, while living here at his grandmother's house in Milwaukee, his violent compulsions consumed him once again. One night, cruising these bars in downtown Milwaukee, he met a young man and took him to this hotel.
I had put some sleeping pills in his drink to render him unconscious. and was just going to spend the night with him. When I woke up in the morning, my forearms were bruised, and his chest was bruised, and blood was coming out of his mouth. He was hanging over the side of the bed, and I have no memory of beating him to death, but I must have. And that's when it all started again.
And once it started again, you found it impossible to stop.
Right. That's when the obsession went into full swing. My only objective was to find the best-looking guy that I could. I went to bathhouses, I went to bars, shopping malls. Their sexual preference didn't matter to me.
Did their race matter to you?
No, their race didn't matter to me. The first two young men were white. The third young man was American Indian. The fourth and fifth were Hispanic. So no, race had nothing to do with it. It was just their looks.
Was it the killing that excited you, or is it what happened after the killing?
No, the killing was just a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that. That's why I tried to create living zombies with uric acid in the drill.
One of those failed experiments to create a living zombie was conducted on this 14-year-old boy. Jeffrey had drilled a hole in his head and poured in acid, a crude attempt at lobotomy that none of his victims survived.
No, the killing wasn't the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control to do with as I wanted. It's not easy to say that, but that's what the motive was.
Was there something sexual in the dismemberment of the bodies for you?
As time went on, yes, I did get there was a sexual part to that. I started saving the skeletons and preserving other parts, and one thing led to another. It took more and more deviant type behaviors to satisfy my urges, and so it just spiraled out of control.
Why the cannibalism?
That was another step. It made me feel like they were a permanent part of me. Besides the just mere curiosity of what it would be like, it made them feel that they were a part of me, and it gave me a sexual satisfaction to do that.
The so-called box incident happened in 1989, when Jeffrey had already killed at least 5 young men.
It was about a 1-foot square box, metal and wood box.
My dad one week came to visit and happened to see it, and he was wondering what was in it. He didn't know. Nobody knew.
And I said, Jeff, open it up. I just want to see what's in there.
We got into a bit of an argument because I wouldn't open it up.
And I said, Jeff, open it up, or I'm going to just take it down into the basement and get a screwdriver or something and open it up.
I was thinking, I've got to stop this from happening.
He got angry, very visibly agitated.
I thought, you know, it's all going to come crashing down now.
Not fathoming what could be in that box, I said, okay, well, just open it up tomorrow then, and then let's get rid of it, whatever it is.
What was in the box?
The mummified head and genitals of a young man I met in one of the bars down in Milwaukee. But the box was never opened, not in my dad's presence. And so the lies continued.
How do you feel about what you did?
I'm glad that it's over. There's nothing, any words I say to the victims' families are just going to seem trite and empty. I don't know how to express the regret, the sorrow, that I feel for what I've done for their sons. I can't find the right words.
Is it still there, Jeff? Does it ever go away?
In part, no, it never completely goes away. I'll probably have to live with it for the rest of my life. I wish it would go away. I wish there was some way to completely get rid of the compulsive thoughts, the feelings. It's not nearly so bad now that there's no avenues to actually act on it. But no, it never seems to go completely away.
So the thoughts still come to you?
Sometimes, yeah.
When our interview at the prison ended, Jeffrey said goodbye to his father. But on his way back to his cell, something caught his eye.
Just a point of interest, that's the type of box.
This is the type of box?
Exactly, yeah, a little bigger.
That's exactly what it looked like?
Right.
All right, mood disorders. Mood disorders come in two forms: depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. In a depressive disorder, the symptoms of depression will occur only, and in a bipolar disorder, the same symptoms of depression will occur, but they will also occur with a manic phase. And a manic phase is when a person becomes generally much more excitable. They're not necessarily happy, but they tend to be much more excitable. And the specifics of the symptomology for any one person could be quite a bit different. So we're going to speak about this in a very general sense. Well, I'll start talking about the bipolar disorder because I think it'll make a little more sense first. A bipolar disorder, if you imagine a scale of emotional range, a person might start right in the center where we'll call it a very normal mood, and then they'll rise up through a period of mania and then dip back down through the process of normalcy and then down into a period of depression and then rise up back out of that through the period of normalcy and then up into mania. And the process will repeat itself in a giant sine wave. And like any wave, the amplitude and the wavelength of it will actually be specifically related to the particular classification of the bipolar affective disorder. But in any case, it all essentially operates the same way. It's a sine wave of emotions over time. So in some cases, the wavelength could be very long, and that will generally be associated with a very high peak of mania and a very low peak in depression. But for a person that cycles more rapidly, generally the peaks tend to be less high overall. In fact, just as a expression of sine wave patterns in this class, you saw the same thing in terms of brainwave patterns when you're asleep. When you first go to sleep, the brainwave patterns have a very low amplitude and a very short cycle, and at stage 4 they have a very high amplitude and a very long cycle. Bipolar affective disorder swings back and forth between depression and mania. For depressive disorder, if you try to imagine cutting off the very top of the sine wave, so you're only left with the lower portion and then a flat area of normalcy in between, that's essentially what a depressive disorder will look like. It is the bottom portion of the sine wave only. When a person rises up to an average emotional range, they basically stay there until they go into another depressive state. And this will happen over and over again. So if you have a bipolar disorder where you're manic and depressive, a depressive disorder where you're only on the low end of the scale, is there a mania-only mood disorder? No, there's not. Actually, it's just a psychiatric process that does not occur. not all possible ways in which a person could become mentally ill actually do exist. And this is actually a very nice example of them. There is no such thing as a unipolar manic disorder. Now, one of the other things you see about mood disorders, in particular depression, exists across the globe. So this is across cultures. Regardless of the society evaluated, women always tend to be more depressed than males. And that is, as the last I checked, 100% of the time. It's a very consistent process. And in fact, whenever you find extremely consistent principles across cultures, again, psychologists will generally fall back onto an evolutionary argument. But what actually causes this to occur is unknown. There may be any number of different biological bases for it, why it might occur, and not a lot of people work on the area, so we're just going to have to wait for the future to find an answer. Depression itself, at least in North America, tends to be highest around age 20 and then decreases across a lifespan. In the study of depression, as we've seen, depression oftentimes occurs as a result of exposure to naturally occurring learned helplessness scenarios in which a person develops a perception that their efforts don't have any influence on the environment, so they largely give up. It seems to be that as a person reaches adulthood in North America, that's when they're faced with the most stress. Because when you take a look at a person's life, from the time they're born until the time that they move out, there's a huge safety net, financial and emotional in terms of family, for most individuals. And then all in one shot, the person gets ejected from the household and they're expected to maintain a job and support themselves and so forth. And there's a lot of stress at that point in their life. However, they're at the least likely part of their life to have the skills enough to actually deal with the stress, because they've just started living on their own and they've just picked up all those responsibilities. They have not developed a lot of management skills. And so as a result, they're more prone to depression. One of the reasons why depression appears to drop off as you get older is because people simply develop better coping skills. You learn how to manage your life to avoid the problems that occur in life by paying bills late, or how you treat people. And as a result, the better management skills lead to less stress, and therefore the opportunities for depression wind up dropping off over the course of your life. Back in the personality chapter, we watched a movie with Aaron Beck that talked about how depressive thinking occurs in a cycle. And we've come back to that issue here while we're still working on mood disorders. In terms of depressive thinking, the cycle of events that Beck and other researchers tended to find back in the 50s and 60s is that some stressful event will occur. And of course, that's going to occur for everybody, because everybody has stress in their life of some sort. Now, for an individual that develops depression, they tend to have a negative self-evaluation. That is, or to say it a slightly different way, they are more likely to exhibit an external locus of control. So you fail an exam and then you wind up saying, this crap always happens to me. Instead of thinking, gee, I need to figure out better ways to study harder next time, or to plan my time better to get the job done or more efficiently, you just wind up not even trying or doing anything and just kind of blaming yourself. That, of course, leads to a depressed mood. And in the depressed mood, you're simply less likely to plan ahead to avoid these problems in the future. And when you let them occur, they will likely occur again. It's a odd thing about life. Bad things will always happen. And this is true for everybody. It doesn't matter how much money you have or who you are. Bad things are always going to happen. But you have to learn to recognize why the bad things happen and then manage your behavior so that you can avoid these bad things in the future. And for individuals that perceive that their efforts don't make any real contact with the environment, they develop that external locus of control. And because they perceive that their behavior is not worthwhile, they stop doing things. And if they are not doing things to avoid problems, they will experience more problems. And therefore, they'll have more stressful events. And as greater and greater problems occur, they become more and more likely to develop depression. So let's consider this question related to depression. Where else did we see the negative cyclic thinking in the personality chapter? That's right. We actually already talked about it. It was the external locus of control. That was specifically the place where we saw it. And it's important for you as a psychology student to be able to connect these 3 points. Learned helplessness from the learning chapter, depression from the psychological disorders chapter, and the external locus of control from the personality chapter. Those 3 things, despite the fact that they are in completely different chapters, all come together in a practical sense when you're talking about treatment for psychological disorders. Because as a therapist, for example, if you're a therapist and you know that a person has depression, there's a very good chance that there has been some degree of unavoidable punishments in their life for which really kind of account for that learned helplessness aspect, and also the possibility that they don't feel that trying actually matters. And as a result, when you pull those things together, you'll actually be much more of an effective therapist to be able to treat this issue of depression. Now, one of the ways in which depression gets treated is through electroconvulsive shock therapy. And we're going to watch a movie that shows you an ECT session. And I want you to see this because I want you to recognize that this is a clean, well-established medical procedure today. It is not the wild craziness that you actually see in literal horror films today. In fact, even ECT of a wild, inappropriate manner kind of plays itself out in horror films now based on those older versions of ECT from the 50s and 60s where it got a bad rap. But the medical community has worked very diligently to consistently reduce the amount of voltage that a person is exposed to give them muscle relaxants, to anesthetize them, to give them anti-anxiety agents. That way they can essentially sleep through the whole thing and still have the effectiveness of the ECT, but without any memory of the seizure itself. ECT, unfortunately, has a side effect of producing a small amount of memory loss, and we'll see that in this particular film. But the memory loss tends to be temporary and is easily overcome.
ECT introduces an electrical current in the brain which causes a minute-long seizure.
The seizure is the therapeutic part of ECT. The electricity is merely the means to the end.
The seizure causes a period of brain quiet, much like a computer that's been turned off. And like a computer, the brain seems to reboot following the treatment. Proponents say ECT stimulates the release of neurotransmitters in depressed people like Michelle in much the same way that antidepressants do, except that ECT does it much faster and more powerfully.
We put a blood pressure cuff on her right ankle. We blow up that blood pressure cuff just before the muscle relaxant is injected so that the foot does not get the muscle relaxant, so that we can see the motor effects of the seizure in her right foot. Beginning to feel it? Yeah. Okay. How you doing? Okay. Michelle? Good. Okay, muscle relaxant is going in. Yes, sir. Okay.
A nerve stimulator is applied to Michelle's left foot, causing her leg to twitch once a second. When the twitching stops, doctors know the muscle relaxant has worked.
In a young person, it takes about a minute or a minute and a half for that to work fully. And then Carol checking Michelle's feet to see that they are relaxed and that her leg feels loose. And then we know it's time to proceed with the treatment itself. Carol's going to put the bite block in now. A hard rubber bite block protects the patient's mouth during the delivery of the stimulus. When the nurse has the patient held appropriately, I push the button. Looks good. Okay. And we watch to see that the seizure occurs, and we can see that by the beating movement in Michelle's foot. Now we're just monitoring the seizure.
Doctors have two ways of charting Michelle's seizure. The motor element is monitored by the beating of Michelle's foot. Additionally, Michelle's brain waves are monitored by the EEG, or electroencephalogram machine.
And there's the end of the EEG seizure right there. Okay. Okay, now we'll just wait for Michelle to wake up. And this is a fairly long seizure. This ends at about 67 seconds here. That's the motor part of the seizure. And then the EEG continues, and that's also quite typical. A young person, first treatment is typically quite long. The seizure, the EEG part of the seizure ends at 139 seconds here. And we'd expect that her next treatments will be much shorter than that.
Michelle Usry has had 5 ECT sessions over the last 2 weeks, and so far the results are positive.
I feel like the cloud has lifted. It's not as dark as it used to be. There's a real pretty sun above it I've never seen before.
Oh, now you're all happy?
I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, because I have never had that before.
Along with the depression, bits of her memory are also gone.
Usually when I get home, I have to open up every single cabinet and go through all of them, try to find what I'm looking for. I just feel lost in my own house, basically. But I mean, it's worth it.
What Michelle is experiencing is very common for ECT patients to have that small amount of memory loss that should clear up fairly quickly.
The next topic we're hitting is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia was discovered in the late 1800s. And since that time, it has been shown to have 5 separate areas of disturbance. In terms of perceptual systems, what you wind up seeing is an enhanced or blunted sense for perceptual events. So people become very sensitive or very insensitive to different types of stimulation, such as light, the taste of salt, or whatever it might actually be. And there tends to be a lack of attentional focus, which you can draw back to the memory chapter. There seems to be much more difficulty in maintaining the rehearsal component of short-term memory, so to reflect what you would actually refer to as attention. In terms of language disturbances, word usage is not consistent, so the vocabulary of the individual will actually change quite a bit. And in fact, there'll be a fairly poor logical flow of ideas. However, a person with schizophrenia who may not be getting treated, that comes up and starts to talk to you on the street, a person who's not familiar with it will think that the person's trying to tell you something, but you're not sure what. And as they continue to talk, you'll get a feeling for the fact that they're kind of talking in circles and just meandering and whatever they're actually saying, and it'll start to cue you in that there's something wrong. People, of course, that work with these individuals will pick up that kind of language disturbance very easily. In terms of thought disturbances, there are delusions that occur in schizophrenia. And delusions are simply false beliefs. The belief that pirates hid treasure underneath of your house, the belief that the CIA is coming to assassinate you, the belief that space aliens are controlling the government, whatever it might actually be. Emotional disturbances. Again, like you saw with perceptual systems, they're either very flattened or very excited. So there's an exaggerated or flattened emotional component. A person will either just not respond to anything, or they will be excessively emotional for all things. And then there's also compulsive behaviors, things like hoarding, for example, or touching things that a person will start to exhibit over time. How these 5 particular characteristics play out for any one individual tends to be fairly specific to them. Although you will wind up seeing these aspects occur in all individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, the disorder occurs in about 1% of the general population, and it typically does come through family lines. There is some evidence that the presence of schizophrenia can just appear. So when nobody in a family line is aware of anybody actually having the diagnosis of schizophrenia, it could just appear. And that may just be related to the random combination of genes at conception, or it could be related to the genes actually being present in other individuals who simply never showed symptomology. It's not always clear. The next 2 statements, though, about fraternal and identical twins is actually very important regarding the overall nature-nurture understanding of psychological disorders and of just psychology itself. If identical twins have identical genes and one identical twin develops the symptoms of schizophrenia, then it's a foregone conclusion that the other twin should also develop schizophrenia as well. Except that's not the case. If one twin gets it, then the identical twin only has about a 50% chance of getting it overall. And the reason why this occurs is partly because the symptomology of schizophrenia does not occur purely from genetic basis, but it actually occurs as a relationship between the presence of the genes and the environment that the person lives in. That is, for you to develop symptoms of schizophrenia, you first must have the minimum 20 genes that are related to schizophrenia. Okay, 20. And that's of course quite a bit different than what you oftentimes hear about in many medical cases. Like there'll be 1 gene for breast cancer or 1 gene for a type of disease. In terms of schizophrenia, there's currently 20 genes recognized. And there could be more, but there's at least 20 that have been identified. So nobody will ever show symptoms of schizophrenia unless they have those 20 genes. But then even having those 20 genes does not guarantee that you're going to exhibit symptoms. You have to be exposed to sufficient stress during your life to cause those genes to kick on and for you to display symptomology. Now, stress. What kind of stress? What actually would constitute stress? Well, I don't have very good answers in that case because stress is still an extremely broad construct. And there are a wide range of stress that people can experience. Stress, things that are stressful for me may not be stressful for you. It's going to be highly individualized. And even if you could identify stress, you would have to know to what degree do they have to be exposed to it. And that's, again, well beyond the quantitative capacity at the current time. What is clear is that individuals that are exposed to a lot of life stress are much more likely to develop the symptoms of schizophrenia. And in fact, you even see this cross-culturally. For members of society that have less money, they are simply more likely to show the symptoms of schizophrenia. And you see that worldwide. So the assumption of what's actually happening is for people with less money, they may tend to have more stress in their life, and as a result, for the same rate of schizophrenia existing all throughout the human population, you simply have more of the symptoms kick on for individuals with less money, on the assumption that less money causes more stress, which isn't necessarily the case, but very well might be in a very broad global sense. Another aspect of the heritability aspect is the relationship of fraternal twins. Remember, the fraternal twins are created by two separate sperm, two separate eggs. And if one of the fraternal twins develops schizophrenia, then there's a 10% chance that the other twin will get it. And that is, of course, much higher than the 1% rate. If a child in a family only has a 1% chance of developing schizophrenia, but they are fraternal twins, but they are not sharing the same genes, you wind up seeing that there's a role of the prenatal environment in establishing whether or not schizophrenia will be shown in adulthood some 20 years later. That leads us to this question. The heritability data indicate that the environment partially controls the presence of schizophrenia. Therefore, can its hallucinations and delusions be controlled by the environment? And the answer is yes. The types of hallucinations and the types of delusions that people have when they're diagnosed with schizophrenia are entirely determined by the culture that the person grows up in. Largely what appears to happen is that as you grow up in a culture, you learn how crazy people are supposed to behave. And then if you wind up displaying the symptoms of schizophrenia, you have already learned how a person with schizophrenia behaves, and then you start playing out the same symptoms. So the types of symptoms that you see in schizophrenia change over the course of the past 130 years or so in which schizophrenia has been diagnosed. For example, very commonly today, paranoid schizophrenia is one of the most common subtypes of schizophrenia. And the paranoia of the schizophrenia is oftentimes about a paranoia about the government, a secret police force. The CIA is coming for you. The FBI is going to try to assassinate you. Space aliens are sending brainwave patterns down from space to control you. All these things about some hidden event that may actually cause problems for you is a thing that plays itself out. Now, this seems to be in part related to the fact that currently in society, we're constantly reminded of things like spies, the CIA, the FBI, secret police forces, clandestine activity, viruses and bacteria that you can't see that may harm you. We're very aware of things that can harm us, but that we can't see and have very little control over. And that type of thinking, largely driven by the media, becomes the basis for the types of symptoms that you see in schizophrenia today. You could ask, were people so paranoid about the government before the CIA ever existed? Okay, in fact, when did the CIA develop? Well, the CIA was essentially the OSS. It was originally created during World War II. Prior to World War II, there was no CIA. And people were not aware of one because, of course, it doesn't exist. As a result, you don't see people being afraid of government agencies trying to come and assassinate them, because that's actually not a story that's told in society. Nor do you hear concern in the delusional thinking of schizophrenia about space aliens trying to control your thought, until aeronautics becomes very common and pilots of aircraft report seeing things in the sky that they can't identify. They become UFOs. The story of UFOs turn into this ridiculous space alien business. The space alien story gets told through the media over and over and over again. If a person develops schizophrenia today, they may wind up with a paranoid fear that space aliens are trying to control their thoughts. But you don't see that. You don't see that before these cultural events had actually occurred, or technological events had occurred. If you go back to the late 1800s, early 20th century, you wind up seeing completely different aspects of symptomology, things that are more specific to their time period. Some of the possible causes of schizophrenia, as you might imagine, given that we've already talked about the biopsychosocial approach, should be related to biology, psychological events, and the culture in which a person lives in. If you look at the biological aspects, it's going to be certainly related to genetics, because, as I've mentioned before, there is a minimum of 20 genes that must be present for a person to develop schizophrenia. And that host of genes is going to be passed from parent to child, so that when you find a person diagnosed with schizophrenia, you can trace it through backwards in time and forwards in time for the family members. And as you move to cousins, from first cousins to second cousins to third cousins to fourth cousins and so forth, you will see less and less chance that any family member will have it. So it appears in a family line, and then as people mix with other families over time, it'll simply disappear. You see that in a variety of different ways as well. And I know this is completely off of schizophrenia, but this is part of the same story. You see it in terms of geniuses like Mozart and Beethoven. You can trace the development of musical capacity in a family where it will play itself out maximally in somebody like a Beethoven or a Mozart, and then it'll just simply die out over time as the children marry other people and the grandchildren marry other people and the great-grandchildren marry other people. Whatever genes were there to establish the pattern of behavior simply shows up at one point and then kind of dies out over time. And you see the exact same thing with schizophrenia. But that's giving you a little bit of a basis for understanding how genes influence behavior in general, not specifically just with a psychological disorder, but how this process actually plays itself out for all patterns of behavior, for anything that can be influenced genetically over the course of multiple generations within a family. In terms of neurotransmitters, there is the dopamine hypothesis. The dopamine hypothesis really accounts for a subset of the symptoms of schizophrenia. It is not intended to explain the entire story of schizophrenia. What the dopamine hypothesis is that an individual who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia tends to have more dopamine functioning at their dopamine cells than do the rest of the population. And one of the ways in which you actually see this play itself out, a way to kind of look at it, an underlying process that matches things up, is when individuals overdose on cocaine. For an individual that uses cocaine a lot, builds up a high tolerance, takes a large amount of it and overdoses, they may display symptoms that are indistinguishable from a person with paranoid schizophrenia. They'll be delusional, they'll hallucinate, they'll have the same patterns of behavior. Yet the following day, when the cocaine is worn off, they'll go back to their normal pattern of behavior. Whereas a person with paranoid schizophrenia will, of course, continue to act this way day in, day out. What you see with cocaine is that one of the primary neurotransmitters that cocaine affects is dopamine. And in fact, it increases the activity of dopamine at its cells. So by increasing to a great degree the activity of dopamine in certain areas of the brain, you wind up with very similar behavior to paranoid schizophrenia. And that's essentially what the dopamine hypothesis is. One of the many, but we'll just stop here, one of the many brain abnormalities that you actually see in individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia is enlarged ventricles. We didn't talk too much about ventricles back in chapter 2, but in the central locations in the center of your brain that generate cerebral spinal fluid, those ventricles tend to be larger in individuals with schizophrenia than you would see in the larger population. And as the last I checked, earlier studies, if you have somebody from a family line that has schizophrenia, you can do a brain scan on them at a young age to determine whether or not their ventricles are larger, and then use that as a predictive event as to whether or not they'll show symptoms as an adult. There are 5 common subtypes of schizophrenia. Paranoid, which we've been talking about, is simply related to fear of, remember, of delusional thinking, like the CIA is going to come to assassinate you, or space aliens are trying to control your thought. Catatonic is one that is much more common back from around 1900. A person with catatonia will exhibit a pattern of what's called waxy flexibility, so that they will essentially function like a mannequin, in which you can shape them in whichever manner that you wish, and they will stay in that state for a long period of time, like a mannequin, but they'll just remain quiet and still. Disorganized schizophrenia is related to the manner in which the symptoms that we have been talking about are displayed. Undifferentiated is related to a process in which the symptoms do not follow a typical pattern. And residual is related to a process where the symptomology may come and go in an unlikely manner. Schizophrenia is related to the diathesis stress model. As the theory of the biopsychosocial model was developed, the diathesis stress model was developed separately, which was a discussion of the combination of how the biological predisposition and environmental stress leads to the expression of schizophrenic symptoms. That is nothing more than the biopsychosocial approach, but it was designed specifically for schizophrenia. So the diathesis stress model and the biopsychosocial approach are essentially doing the same job, but the diathesis stress model is the term that you generally use when you're specifically talking about schizophrenia, as opposed to the biopsychosocial approach, which you can use in a more general sense. A variety of other disorders occur that you would see in the DSM. Some that are actually fairly common, like substance-related disorders. Substance-related disorders are specific to the type of drug that a person is addicted to. So there will be a separate category for nicotine addiction, alcohol addiction, cocaine addiction, methamphetamine addiction, heroin addiction, and so forth. And the reason why each of those particular substance-related disorders are categorized differently is not just because they're using a different drug, but different drugs are accessible to different degrees. Like alcohol is very easily accessible, and that affects the overarching pathway of life events for the person who has access to alcohol, whereas heroin, for example, is much more difficult to come by. You can still get it, but it leads to a wide variety of different types of problems. Whereas it's expensive, you oftentimes become homeless, then a person has to engage in illegal activity, usually to obtain money to be able to obtain the heroin. And that may play out very differently than a person who is an alcoholic, who might manage their drinking somewhat to keep a job, but then will drink much more when they get home. Dissociative disorders, you have some connection with already. You've probably heard of dissociative identity disorder. That is multiple personality disorder. Multiple personality disorder is simply the old term for dissociative identity disorder. So technically, multiple personality disorder doesn't exist anymore, but the same set of symptoms are actually simply called dissociative identity disorder. And that is a disorder in which a person appears to have multiple personalities. We're actually going to talk about that on the next slide a little bit, so I'm going to hold off just yet. Depersonalization disorder is a disorder in which a person does not feel like they are part of their own body. So, for example, this oftentimes happens, depersonalization oftentimes happens during panic attacks that we talked about earlier in the chapter. A person will have the physical sensation of being separate from their own body, almost as if they were a little person inside of their own head and operating their body like it were a giant robot, just like you would see in a cartoon. And a person actually has that feeling. That's essentially what depersonalization is. But for the disorder, in this particular case, it tends to be very consistent, not like in panic attacks where a person will feel that way for 10, 15 minutes and it'll go away. In a dissociative disorder, the person will have this experience fairly consistently. And then in personality disorders, just two that we're going to talk about is the antisocial personality disorder, in which a person tends to be very argumentative with other individuals, tends to stay away from other people. The last slide here we have to work with for this particular chapter is how the disorders that you see are actually specific across cultures. There are some components of psychological disorders that occur specifically within the geopolitical borders of a single individual country. And you might ask, how could that possibly be the case? Well, think of the biopsychosocial model. Two components of the biopsychosocial model are related to the environment, and the environment feeds the types of symptoms that a person will have. So any one particular culture can feed a certain type of symptoms to an individual based upon the culture of that specific geopolitical boundary. And therefore, as you physically cross a border into a new country, there may be a type of disorder that exists there that was not in the previous country. Or you can go from one area where there is a disorder and simply cross a border into another country, and that disorder will no longer be recognized as a valid disorder because it doesn't exist in that culture. Here's a list of some of the ones that are actually known. Anorexia nervosa, which of course gets a lot of play in the media. Anorexia today is oftentimes associated with things like having young girls look too much at Vogue magazine and Cosmo and seeing too many skinny models. And that's all ridiculous bullshit. That's just more nonsense from the media. Anorexia has existed at least since the time of ancient Rome, where it was documented to exist as a disorder, where people willingly stopped eating for no recognizable reason and simply starved themselves to death. So it's been around for 2,000 years, and there certainly was no Vogue magazine back at the time. It's just a bad idea that you kind of throw that around today, that it's Vogue magazine is responsible for anorexia. Anorexia is also specifically related to Western cultures. You typically don't see it elsewhere around the globe. You might, but you generally don't. There is something about Western culture, and it's not even clear what that could possibly be. I think the issue is too broad when you're talking about Western culture, because Western culture is so broad. It's going to be very, very different. Jamaican culture is going to be very different than Romanian culture, but they're both Western. What's the commonality between Jamaica and Romania? I don't have a clue, but they're both there, and you may wind up seeing anorexia in both places. Multiple personality disorder exists almost entirely in the United States only. If you cross the United States into Canada, it's not there. If you leave the United States and go into Mexico, it's not there. About the last place that you can be diagnosed with multiple personality disorder is the United States. And this is just a hangover from Freudian times. The development of multiple personality disorder grew out of Freudian theory back in the 1930s, in which a single individual reported that during a time of stress, when the child, I believe as a child, was being physically abused and ran away from his father and hid underneath of the house, that he had the experience of seeing himself run away across a field. And that kind of added to the beginning of the story of how multiple personality developed, and it was embellished upon by Freudian psychologists over time, became a very popular idea, and then ran through a series of iterations, like the story of Sybil, who was supposed to have had 16 personalities. But what you may not realize is the story of Sybil, who had 16 personalities, was a complete lie. The story of Sybil having 16 personalities was completely made up by the psychiatrist who was treating Sybil. The psychiatrist lied, made it up, and later on recanted a story. But because it was such juicy gossip, the media has continued to feed that misinformation over time, so that people still believe that Sybil was actually a person with 16 personalities. Simply doesn't exist. It is specifically an American personality disorder, which is simply on the decline, because if it's so culturally specific, it doesn't seem like it's a real underlying universal disorder, and therefore the psychiatric community tends to downplay it more now, and it'll probably just eventually disappear altogether. The next one, ataxia nervosa, generally comes from Latin cultures, mostly down in South America. It's nothing more than a bad panic attack. Something bad happens, a person has an attack of nerves, and that's essentially it. But it plays out in a very specific cultural manner that you wouldn't wind up seeing in other places. Brain fog, oftentimes associated with West Africa, oftentimes related to excessive education. Too much thinking causes a person to feel like they have a foggy brain and they have difficulty concentrating. And that is a issue that you see classified as brain fog, but you don't see it so much play itself out in a diagnosable disorder elsewhere. I'm sure you, as a college student, have gone through periods where you've studied and studied and studied and just can't pay attention to anything anymore, and you say, I've studied too much, I'm tired. But if you lived in West Africa, you would kind of have a cultural standpoint to understand that aspect being being related to something broader, and it might become related to brain fog. And your belief in the existence of brain fog could cause it to occur worse. Whereas for me, as an American, I just need a break. I don't think about brain fog as an actual thing. I don't expect to get it. And so a few days off from studying, and I'm good as new again. Possession by the Tsar occurs only in Ethiopia. Possession by the Tsar is a time when a person will speak in tongues, behave very oddly. There's a description in the textbook that you should take a look at. It is not something that you typically would see in North America. It looks very much like a kind of a supernatural, religious sort of display, but it occurs in Ethiopia specifically based upon the culture that's there. Running amok, which is actually a term that has reached your own language when you talk about somebody running amok, that comes from Southeast Asia, where a person, usually who is under stress for a long period of time, just goes on a violent spree. Now, if that happened here, that would be considered a violent spree, and you would go off to jail for committing violence. In Southeast Asia, it is a psychological disorder. You had too much stress, you run around, you smash things up, you attack people. It's a psychological disorder. And so it would be less likely to be seen as an issue for jail time and more as an issue for psychiatric treatment. And Koro, which exists primarily in South China and Vietnam, and as I understand also in India as well. Koro is a unique psychological disorder in that area of the globe in which a man thinks that his penis is shrinking and that when it fully shrinks into his body, he's going to die. And that's what Koro is. And there are sometimes widespread components where Koro seems to spread through society at one large time, like you would call a mass hysteria of Koro. And I've actually read newspaper articles where in India, cars outfitted with megaphones will drive through the street telling people that Koro is not a real thing and that they're not going to die when their penis shrinks up inside their body. But you don't see Koro elsewhere on the globe. And, you know, I could guess now most of you are probably giggling about Koro because it sounds really ridiculous to somebody from a North American standpoint. But just imagine how ridiculous multiple personality sounds like to somebody from South China and Vietnam when they find out the only place you can have multiple personalities is in the United States. It's just another variation of how the underlying stress reactions that a person experiences that winds up developing a psychological disorder play themselves out specifically through the process of their own culture. And that is where we end with the psychological disorders chapter.